Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Chapter 11 of our Democracies at War lectures. We will have a look today at Islamist global terrorism, more specifically Islamist terrorism, and the hypothesis that I put forward in this last lecture regards the possible perverse effect of our Western liberal democracies' wars. That is to say, I wonder whether these wars might backfire in the form of the terrorist attacks that took place in our Western societies for 2 decades now, since 9/11. So we saw in our previous chapters throughout the different chapters of this course that since the end of the Cold War, the Western liberal democracies have been fighting a significant amount of offensive wars overseas, wars of choice, rather than wars of necessity. On the one hand, so-called humanitarian interventions within states whose regimes were accused of massively violating basic human rights of their own population or a significant minority within their population. This was the case for the wars in Bosnia in 95, in Kosovo 1999, and against Gaddafi's Libya in 2011. And on the other hand, military operations were also launched within the so-called global war on terror after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. These wars, these military operations were fought against either terrorist networks themselves and or regimes, rogue states accused of sponsoring them, harboring them, if not using terrorist methods themselves. This was the case in Afghanistan 2001, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom against Iraq, Saddam Hussein 2003, and also the Western liberal democracies' intervention against the Islamic State from 2014 onwards, notably in Syria. We also saw, ladies and gentlemen, that in order to wage these wars, Western liberal democracies adapted the conduct of the war that they were fighting, their warfare, the way they waged their military operations. And more specifically, they used professional armies, supplemented by corporate warriors, and they developed new weapons technologies, privileging the use of standoff systems, notably drones, which permit to wage zero-death wars for themselves, of course, because these weapons project military force without projecting vulnerability. No soldiers killed in action, no prisoners of war. These evolutions, ladies and gentlemen, contribute to explain why the Western democracies won the wars they fought, or at least they won them from a military point of view. That is to say, as regards the military operations strictly defined that they launched. We already saw this in another chapter. The different operations lasted 5-6 weeks, 3 months, 5 or 6 weeks as regards the 2 operations against Iraq, 91 and in 2003. The Taliban were ousted from Kabul within a similar period of 6 weeks. Operation Unified Protector against Gaddafi lasted a bit longer. At least Gaddafi was killed 6 months after the beginning of the Western powers' military intervention. The only exception to some extent is the fight against ISIS, which lasted longer for the very simple reason that the Western liberal democracies chose a light footprint strategy. That is to say, they did not send ground forces. They used precisely a distant bombing. So military victories. And of course, if I emphasize the military victories of the Western powers' military operations, I indirectly admit that the political outcome of democratic wars is somehow different, or at least much more complex. From a political point of view, indeed, a war is won by a belligerent if its opponent accepts to submit to the political will of the belligerents that won on the battlefield. That is to say, a war is won if the opponent accepts to do what the winner wants it to do. Remember the definition of Karl von Clausewitz that we gave in our introductory chapter. One of the two definitions: war is an act of violence thanks to which we want our opponent to fulfill our will. So we use violence in order to force our opponent to do what we want them to do. And this means, of course, that as long as an opponent, though militarily defeated, refuses to submit politically, refuses to capitulate politically, to submit to the winners, the military winners, well, this military winner does not win the war politically, though they gained the upper hand on the battlefield, for the very simple reason that war or violence is not an end in itself, but a means precisely to a political end. And the different events that followed the Western military interventions, or at least some of them, tend to corroborate the difference that we should make between political and military victory. In Afghanistan 2001, in Iraq 2003, in Libya 2011, the Western military interventions were militarily successful, but politically speaking, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, where Western troops occupied the territory in order to build a state, a regime, which did not exist, or in Libya, where no such state-building operation occurred. In the three cases, the Western liberal democracies, despite their military victory, were unable, obviously, to carry the decision. Iraq, after 2003, was characterized by a never-ending civil war, and it gave rise also, at least indirectly, to ISIS. Afghanistan turned into America's longest war ever, and Biden took the decision almost 20 years after the beginning of said war in 2021, August 2021, to withdraw the troops, acknowledging that America would be unable to maintain a pro-American regime in Kabul. And Libya, ever since 2011, is a definitive mess, whose consequences spill over in the whole Sahel region, not to mention the migration flows. So the Western political success is obviously not present. It is not the first time, ladies and gentlemen, that Western powers are confronted with adversaries unwilling to submit to their political will, though being militarily inferior, and though also suffering defeats on the battlefield. Napoleon's Grande Armée in Spain at the beginning of the 19th century, and the British colonial troops in Afghanistan during the 1850s, 60s, American GIs in Vietnam in the 1960s, at the very beginning of the 70s, all were harassed and eventually repelled by Spanish guerrilla fighters regarding Napoleon, by Afghan tribes regarding the British Empire of India, the Afghan tribes who impressed Friedrich Engels, who wrote a book review about the incapacity of any foreign invader to control said Afghan tribes, and American GIs were defeated by the communist Viet Minh in Vietnam. I focus here on Western armies, but the same is true for non-liberal armies. The Nazis had to cope with the French resistance. The Soviets, the Soviet Red Army, during 10 years tried to control Afghanistan, and it was forced to withdraw because of the guerrilla adopted by the Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters, and to some extent, maybe this is what is happening to Putin's Russian army in Ukraine. Anyway, the important point here, the important concept is guerrilla. Guerrilla is a Spanish term. It means pequeña guerra, small war. And this precisely, its origin is Spanish because it was the tactics adopted by Napoleon's Spanish adversary at the beginning of the 19th century. And since then, of course, it has been used, this term guerrilla has been used to designate irregular mobile warfare against colonial powers, against foreign occupation forces, sometimes against one's own domestic oppressive regime. So mobile warfare, irregular mobile warfare adopted by small size and lightly armed forces, which are inferior in numbers, but benefit from a fairly significant popular backing. And guerrilla forces usually control either a significant part of a territory or some sectors of the population in the states concerned, and they resort to fighting tactics, including operations behind the enemy lines, ambushing of security or military forces, hit and run attacking, sabotaging infrastructures and supply lines, of course, of the opponent's capabilities. These tactics, ladies and gentlemen, which are used either offensively by insurgents, rebels, revolutionaries, or defensively by resistance fighters, characterize also the contemporary warfare to which resort some opponents to the Western armies that intervene overseas, notably in the Arab Muslim world. But these opponents also resort to another kind of war. Another kind of war is the term used in the title of the book published very recently by John Lynn, Terrorism as Another Kind of War. And it is precisely then terrorism, which is this other kind of war, this other type of warfare to which opponents to the Western interventions in Arab Muslim countries resort in order to try to get rid precisely of the Western presence. In the past, to come back to guerrilla fighters, some guerrilla fighters were tempted, temporarily at least, to use terrorist methods, notably in the forms of attacks, of kidnapping, of coercion. But generally, and at least from a kind of ideal, typical point of view, this was very exceptional. Why? Because guerrillas, by definition, try to gain the hearts and minds of the populations on behalf of which they claimed that they were fighting. That is to say, their aim was to be in the people, the populations, like a fish in water. This is an expression which goes back to the guerrilla fighters of the 60s, Che Guevara on one hand in Latin America, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. So they did not use terrorist methods because this would not permit them to gain from a moral point of view. And there is even a book published by Max Abrams, Rules for Rebels, who distinguishes guerrillas from terrorists, and he claims that those who win precisely are the guerrillas because they do not use terrorist methods. And terrorists, if they fail, eventually, it is because of the means that they use. They do not respect the basic needs of the populations whose interests and needs they claim to promote. Anyway, since the end of the Cold War, terrorism has become a major way of war adopted by those who fight against Western military interventions, notably in the Arab Muslim world. Terrorism, and should I say global Islamist terrorism, why? Because of the transnational character of the terrorist actions undertaken not merely in the states where Western powers do intervene, but also in the societies on the territories of said Western liberal democracies. So worldwide terrorism, thanks to transnational networks. And that does come to the core point of today's chapter, ladies and gentlemen. I establish a link between terrorism and the Western presence following the Western military interventions in the Arab Muslim world. There is a link, to put it differently than I posit, between terrorism and military occupation. So the following assumptions will be at the roots of the analysis that I propose to you. First, terrorism is a specific form of political violence. It is not a criminal activity. It's not a psychological insanity. First point. Second point, global Islamic or Islamist, should I say, terrorism is all at once similar and different from past forms of terrorism. And the worldwide attacks, terrorist attacks that took place notably in our Western world since 21, since 9/11, are, it is the hypothesis, the basic hypothesis, are to some extent the response to which political groups eager to get rid of the Western presence in their countries, the political form of political violence to which they resort in order to do what? In order to rebalance the interactions with the Western powers, and in order to try to impose their will to the Western powers, in order to convince them to leave and to no longer to leave their countries and to no longer intervene in these countries, or to no longer back the regimes in said countries. To put it differently, it is the title of today's chapter. My analysis will focus on Islamist terrorism as a kind of backfire, a kind of backlash, a kind of boomerang effect of Western wars upon our Western domestic societies, which does not mean that these terrorist attacks are quantitatively the most important. Here's a list of the major massive Islamist attacks that took place in Western liberal democracies for 2 decades now. They are by far less numerous than the terrorist attacks that take place elsewhere, both in the past and in very recent years. Here's a list of the countries most affected by terrorism, and you see that in 2019, the United Kingdom was the first Western country hit by terrorist regimes, but it's ranked 28. That is to say, many other countries, of course, are targets of many more terrorist attacks. Regarding the US, I found the statistics according to which since 9/11, nearly twice as many people were killed in the US by non-Muslim terrorist acts than by Muslim terrorist acts. Non-Muslim terrorist acts, that is to say, attacks by white supremacists, by anti-government fanatics. So we should have this in mind. I will less focus, given the topic of my lectures, on the effects of our Western democratic wars on the risks of terrorist attacks in our societies. So this, of course, is a debatable hypothesis. I nevertheless hope I will be rigorous. And my argumentation will be structured in 3 points. I first will have a look at terrorism as a form of political violence. That is to say, I will tackle the problem of the definition of terrorism. Terrorism is an essentially contested concept. There is no consensus when it comes to define it. Then I will look at the evolution of terrorism since it emerged at the end of the 19th century, in the contemporary meaning of the term at least, in order to show both the common points of Islamist terrorism with past forms of terrorism and the specificities. And in the third section, then, I will go into the details of my hypothesis, consisting in saying that Islamist groups resort to terrorist attacks, to suicide attacks in Western societies, in order to compensate for the technological advantages that the Western powers benefit when they wage their wars in the countries of the networks concerned. Section number 1, the definition of terrorism. And the first point I have to emphasize here is there is no consensual definition of terrorism. I allude here to the 2 major handbooks, the Routledge Handbook and the Oxford Handbook, which propose both samples of definitions of terrorism. There are hundreds of definitions and no consensual definition. Why is this the case? Well, first and foremost, because terrorism is both an academic concept, designates a specific form of violence, we'll come back to this, but it is also, of course, a rhetorical device. And that is to say, it is a term, pejorative term, it has a pejorative connotation. Those who use the term terrorists to designate somebody else, of course, stigmatize the one they consider to be a terrorist. They morally condemn what a terrorist is doing. They aim at delegitimizing a terrorist conduct. And as such, a terrorist is close to racist terms such as racist, imperialist, fascist, whose negative connotation, of course, is self-evident. Terrorists themselves, of course, or those who are considered to be terrorists, do not consider themselves to be terrorists. They consider themselves to be revolutionaries, to be resistance fighters, to be martyrs, to be freedom fighters, to be soldiers, and even students. Taliban means student. And what's more, some terrorists now were freedom fighters before being considered to be terrorists. This was the case of the Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters during the 1980s. That is to say, during the Cold War, they were fighting against the Red Army, which occupied Afghanistan, and they received the political and the military support, indirect, of the Americans, who sent them notably Stinger surface-to-air missiles, which permitted them to down the Soviet Army's aircraft. But once the Soviets withdrew, the Mujahideen managed to conquer the power in Kabul. The Taliban arrived, and they were no longer considered to be freedom fighters, or the less so after 9/11, of course. To put it differently and to sum up bluntly this point, ladies and gentlemen, definitions of terrorism, of course, are somehow molded in order to fit the needs, the interests, and the ethics of those who use the definition, of course. Second preliminary point, the etymology of terrorism. And the historical meaning when used for the first time, different from nowadays meaning. The word terror, which is at the roots of the word terrorism, the word terror derives from the Latin terere, which means to bring someone to tremble through a great fear, to bring someone to tremble through great fear. And as such, it has no political significance. It actually designates a kind of psychological state of mind. The term entered the French language in the 14th century, as far as I know, then the English language in the 16th century, and it is in the 16th century in France that it received its first political meaning. It was used in a political perspective by the French legal and political thinker Jean Bodin in his 6 books on the Commonwealth, Les 6 livres de la République, where he defined terror, or where he used the term terror in the following sentence. Listen to this: cruelty that keeps men in fear and inactive, inspiring the subject with terror of the prince. Jean Bodin was a political thinker favorable to the absolutist monarchy. He lived in the period of the religious quarrels opposing the French Catholics to the French Protestants. Protestants were mercilessly killed, and he was eager to reestablish a kind of order, stability, peace within the French kingdom. So he was favorable to terror. He was favorable to terror because it, when used by the prince, the French king, it permitted to keep men in fear. Cruelty was necessary to prevent people from uprising, from trying to get rid of the legal existing order. So he was favorable to the Catholics, opposed to any Protestant uprising. And it is this first meaning which, directly or indirectly, is also shared by Thomas Hobbes, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and by Montesquieu. So it is anything but surprising that the first explicit use by politicians and no more by academics of the word terror was used to designate a legal, or at least a legitimate, instrument used by the political authority of a state to maintain order. And this precisely will be the case of the French revolutionary Robespierre during the last years of the French Revolution, when Jacobins dominated the French Revolution. And Maximilien de Robespierre proposed the following definition of terror. Terror is nothing else than immediate justice, severe, inflexible. This immediate justice is needed to do what? To bring justice to all traitors. There is no other means to inspire the necessary terror that will consolidate the revolution. The French revolutionaries, and more specifically the Jacobins, in 1792 and 1793, the beginning of 1794, the most radical period of the French Revolution, claimed that they had to use terror, using the guillotine to eliminate their opponents in order to save the revolution, the French Revolution, or their conception of the French Revolution, both against domestic opponents, those who wanted to re-establish monarchy, and against the French foreign invaders, of course. So here then, when it was used in the political context of the French Revolution, terror was a legitimate means of state violence. So almost perfectly the opposite of what we nowadays do spontaneously have in mind when using the term terrorism. So there is a kind of shift that occurred. There's an evolution that occurred, a twofold evolution which from the original meaning of terror as a legitimate means to nowadays non-state, illegitimate terrorist attacks. This evolution took place at the end of the French Revolution and a bit less than 100 years later at the end of the 19th century. So the first shift, the first evolution is the following one. Robespierre used terror, and he claimed that he had to do so in order to maintain the French Revolution, but to some extent in order to consolidate his own authority. And he ended up eliminating many of his former revolutionary fellows because maybe he considered them not to be either liable or revolutionary enough. And thus, he himself ended up being accused by some of his supporters who feared for their own life. They feared that they might be the victims of Robespierre himself. He was accused of no longer practicing terror, but of practicing terrorism. So here then we have the shift from the term terror to the term terrorism. Terrorism is abusive terror. Terrorism is illegitimate, arbitrary, excessive terror, and therefore no more legitimate. And it is illegitimate terror used against members of the political authority, against representatives of, at that time, the French government or the French elected deputies. So terrorism, the first shift, means to use excessive terror. And we have here a first negative connotation. Second negative connotation will be added to the first one roughly 70 to 80 years later, when once again representatives of political authorities were the target of activists trying to kill them, and these activists were no longer other political authorities but non-state groups. At the end of the 1880s, 1890s, in the US, in France, in Spain, in Russia, in Italy, activists used violence to try to kill politicians, that is to say, members of the political authority of the states concerned. And thus, the non-state actor dimension was added to the negative connotation. Ever since then, ladies and gentlemen, when we use the term terrorism, and this is then what I will be doing in this class too, in this lecture too, when we use the term terrorism, we think of non-state actors resorting to attacks which somehow by definition are considered to be illegitimate. Violent attacks staged by non-state actors are now what we are thinking of when using the term terrorism. So there is a kind of agreement regarding the etymological origin and the linguistic evolution of the term, but this agreement did not permit a consensual definition to emerge. This also is due to the fact that terrorism is studied, and I here focus on terrorism as an academic term. It is studied by researchers of many disciplines whose perspective is different and whose cognitive interest is different. Of course, political science, war studies, law, criminology, religious studies, communication studies, psychology, all these disciplines are interested in studying terrorism, and therefore they propose definitions that by definition somehow cannot but be different from one another. And then what's more, definitions are also proposed by governments, by intelligence services, by international organizations. The League of Nations was the first to propose definition. The United Nations also tries, and as far as I know, did not manage to propose a definitive definition accepted by everybody of terrorism. Alex Schmidt, in his Routledge Handbook of Terrorism Studies, proposes a sample, ladies and gentlemen, of 250 definitions. It's merely a sample, 250 definitions, and it is merely a sample of existing definitions. So I sometimes am tempted to prefer the shortest and somehow the most relevant definition, which goes back to an old Chinese saying, kill one and frighten thousands. Kill one and frighten thousands. You will see on this slide and the following one different definitions that were put forward in the political science discipline. You can find them in Alex Schmidt's Routledge Handbook. Alex Schmidt himself proposed what he considered to be a good enough definition. As I say, he undertook a research asking many academics studying terrorism. Terrorism studies has become a kind of cottage industry during the last 2 decades, and he comes to a definition from which we can, or from which I feel free to deduce the 3 dimensions, the 3 core elements that we find in the vast majority of definitions of terrorism. Terrorism first is a direct action, a practice. Terrorism is a specific form of political violence, second point. And the third point, terrorism also is a means of communication. So let's have a detailed look at these 3 core elements. Terrorism first. What characterizes terrorism is the fact that it is a direct action, a practice. That is to say, it is a practice that consists in deliberately planned and regularly occurring acts of shocking violence. Shocking violence such as murders, of course, be they personalized or depersonalized murders, bombings, including suicide bombings, ladder bombs, vehicle-based bombs such as cars or lorries, which can also be used as rams. Hijacking, skyjacking also are terrorist direct actions. Kidnapping, acts of hostage taking, of course. These acts of shocking violence are undertaken by non-state actors in the contemporary meaning of terrorism. Sometimes we use the term terror regime, Stalin's terror regime, the terror regime of the Red Khmers in Cambodia. But this refers to the original meaning or the original meaning of terrorism under Robespierre, excessive terror. So here we focus on non-state actors. So non-state actors are at the origin of these direct actions, these shocking acts of violence. And these non-state actors reach from lone wolf individuals to small cells of underground organizations up to transnational networks. These networks, of course, are embedded in violence-prone ideological movements. Second point, terrorism is a specific form of political and clandestine violence. That is to say, it is a political violence because the immediate victims, the people who die in the terrorist attacks, are not the ultimate addressee. The people who die, be they randomly hit individual, civilians, non-combatants, or sometimes symbolic agents, politicians, members of security forces or of the army, sometimes clergymen, teachers. These immediate victims, those who die, those who are killed in terrorist actions are not the primary addressee. Why? Because the aim of these attacks is to influence the political authority within the entity within which these terrorist attacks take place. The aim of the terrorist attacks is to influence the political process, to provoke a political change, to incite the political authority indirectly targeted to do what the terrorists want it to do. And therefore, it is a political violence that should be distinguished, of course, from criminal or psychotic violence. Though sometimes, of course, perpetrators of terrorist attacks, those who stage them very concretely, sometimes they include figures from organized crime or mentally disturbed individuals or idiosyncratic individuals who are conducting a kind of personal revenge or personal crusade against society within which they are living. But in this case, this is first and foremost the case for lone wolf attacks. These attacks must repeat themselves in order to become terrorist acts. One single lone wolf attack is not considered to be a terrorist action. There must be a series of actions, a sequence of actions, in order to somehow raise the expectation among the two audiences, those who may be randomly hit, the victims, and those, the political authority, which are indirectly targeted by the attacks, in order to raise among these two audiences the expectation that other actions will come, because without this expectation, by definition, there will be no change adopted by the political authority. That is to say, the terrorist attacks know that they have to repeat their actions in order to try to obtain what they are looking for. There must be a kind of a conscious plan or a perception of a conscious plan, a conscious campaign, a series of attacks where anybody randomly can be killed. And we thus come to the third point. Terrorism is also a means of a communication, a means of a communication because it resorts to publicity or rumor, engendering acts of shocking violence. The aim of these acts is to produce a perception of vulnerability among the target audiences, a perception of vulnerability highly disproportional to the total amount of violence used or likely to be used in the future. That is to say, there are some tens or hundreds of people who are likely to be killed, but millions of people are afraid of prospectively being the target of the next attack. So this perception of vulnerability, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty important due to the unexpectedness, due to the randomness of the terrorist targeting, which is synonymous with people being defenseless, helpless. The victims are likely to be arbitrarily killed when having a drink in a bar, when lining up in an airport, etc., etc. And the means of communication, the dimension means of communication also is important because those who stage these attacks want to seduce potential sympathizers in order to mobilize them in their political struggle. And they also want to impress potential rival organization. Here, the immediate empirical illustration that we can give is Al-Qaeda versus the Islamic State, rival organization within the same jihad resulting to terrorist attacks. So these characteristics, ladies and gentlemen, a direct action practice, a specific form of clandestine political violence, and the means of communication, these three characteristics are present in all the various different types of terrorism that we can distinguish since terrorism emerged roughly 133 years ago at the end of the 19th century. And I thus come to my second point, the historical evolution, I here refer to David Rappaport's so-called four waves model. David Rappaport distinguishes four waves of terrorism: the anarchist wave, the anti-colonial wave, the new left wave, and the one we are witnessing. And now there is the religious wave. I would focus on the Islamist terrorism within this fourth religious wave. All the four waves, at least the three first one, lasted a bit more than one generation, 30 to 40 years. And the first one then was the anarchist wave, which goes back to the end of the 19th century. Terrorism was used as a form of political violence by anarchists. Anarchists, ladies and gentlemen, you may know that, of course, are radical left-wing activists who adhere to a doctrine called anarchism, which was a rival doctrine among the left of Marxism. Both try to seduce the proletarians, the working class. And they were rivals because there is different conception, opposing or distinguishing, but also opposing Marxists to anarchists. Marxists claim that the revolution, there must be a revolution, a socialist revolution, which will permit the dictatorship of the proletariats to prevail, and this then will start the process of the state gradually withering away. And anarchists, to some extent, are less patient. They want to abolish the state. They want to accelerate what they consider to be the process of history towards the classless society, so that they want to abolish the state. So some left-wing radicals in the 1860s, 1870s came to the conclusion that the traditional working class, the means used by the working class did not work, be it strikes or be it battles on barricades, such as, for instance, in 1848 in France or in 1870, the Paris Commune. And so they looked for a new way of fighting politically. And what did they do? Well, since they were not that numerous, since they were unable to mobilize the masses, they adopted what they called the propaganda of the deed. The propaganda of the deed, that is to say, in the tradition of the Greek tyrannicide, they started to try to kill the politicians in order to show to the masses that the state was unable to protect the members of the government, in order to incite the masses to stage revolution, since if they were able to get rid, to kill physically members of the government, this tended to prove, according to them, that it was somehow possible to overthrow the regime. So they used this terrorist attack as a deed whose aim was to serve as a propaganda of the deed. And when once they undertook their attacks, they refused to flee in order to show to everybody the political dimension of their acts, the non-criminal intention that drove them. And so they were, of course, made prisoner and sentenced to death. So they accepted to some extent to sacrifice their own life for what they consider to be their political cause. Anarchist terrorists, first and foremost, were very active in Russia, the so-called nihilists. Tsar Alexander II was killed in 1881, notably in South Europe too, Italy, Spain, and France. Various anarchist terrorists did undertake attacks in Barcelona against the theater Liceu on the Ramblas. 20 people were killed in the 1880s. An Italian anarchist killed the French president Sadi Carnot in the 1890s. And another Italian terrorist killed the Empress Elizabeth of Austria. It was the emperor who was targeted, but the attacker, the terrorist, missed the target, and so he killed the Empress. Last but not least, the American President McKinley, he who had fought the war in Cuba, which we saw last week, was also the victim of anarchists of Polish origin in 1901. So this first wave, ladies and gentlemen, lasted one generation. Why? Because not longer than that, because the anarchists, of course, were absolutely unable to change the policy of the states concerned. And so anarchism, since it was unable also to mobilize the masses, comparably to the communist parties or the social democratic parties, anarchism gradually declined at the beginning of the 20th century. A second wave emerged then, anti-colonial terrorism. And anti-colonial terrorism wants to create states of their own, that is to say, states in favor of those who resort to anti-colonial terrorism. The background, the context, the historical context is both Wilson's and the Bolsheviks' appeal in favor of the right to collective self-determination. That is to say, according to the Bolsheviks and also to Woodrow Wilson, one of his 14 points, in the 14-point speech, colonial peoples should be allowed to determine themselves, their political fates, the collective right of self-determination. And this collective right to self-determination was put into practice in Eastern Europe, where the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, of the Austrian Empire, of the German Empire after their defeat in World War I, permitted different Central and Eastern European nowadays states to become independent. But this was not the case overseas, not in Africa, not in South Asia, and not even in the Near East, despite the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Why? Because in the Near East and in the Middle East, the territories concerned became mandatory territories of the French and the British, thanks to a mandate that was acknowledged to the French and the British by the League of Nations. So this was the case in the then territory of today's Iraq, of today's Jordan, of today's Lebanon, today's Syria, and of today's Palestine, or today's Israel. That is to say, in the mandatory territory of Palestine, where Palestinians were living, gradually Jewish settlers arrived. And the Jewish settlers, or some of them at least, were eager to establish their own state. And they ended up to use terrorist means against, at that time, the majority of Arab Palestinians, to try to expel them, to force them to leave the territory that Jews consider to be their homeland. And what's more, Jewish terrorists also attacked the British mandatory authority in 1946. A very important terrorist attack occurred, targeting the British headquarters at the hotel, the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. More than 90 people were killed. This attack was led by the Irgun, which was one of the two major terrorist groups of the Jews. And the Irgun was led by Menachem Begin, who later became the Prime Minister of Israel in the second half of the 1970s. This attack, of course, accelerated Great Britain's decision to withdraw, and it contributed to Israel's independence 2 years later in 1948. So in Israel, anti-colonial terrorism was applied in Algeria too. Algeria, that is to say, the then French colonial territory, considered to be a French département. And the FLN, the National Liberation Front, used also terrorist attacks against the French to obtain its independence, which it managed to do so after 8 years of a bloody war, 54 to 1962. So these three examples tend to prove that anti-colonial terrorism was somehow successful. It was by far the most successful form of terrorism, successful in the meaning of terrorists achieving what they were looking for. And this success, ladies and gentlemen, can be explained by the fact that these anti-colonial terrorists benefited from a very significant support of the population concerned. The communities concerned had sympathies for the terrorist groups, both among the Jews and in Algeria. So what did these terrorists then do? They did not target politicians as anarchists had done. No, they targeted security forces that were precisely designated as occupying forces. Security forces concerned were notably the police of the colonial powers, the French in Algeria, the British in Palestine. And since policemen, to some extent, are not well prepared to fight successfully against terrorist violence, what the British do, and the French do, they send troops. They send military troops. And these troops, of course, committed a mistake to use in this criminal violence in order to try to get rid of the terrorists. In doing so, they convinced among the general population new activists to join the terrorist networks, whose importance logically grew, which permitted them to fight a guerrilla war, which ended up permitting them to liberate the territory that they wanted to transform into their homeland after expelling the foreign occupier, the British in Palestine, the French in Algeria. This second wave, ladies and gentlemen, the most successful one, though not all the terrorist groups resorting to this anti-colonial terrorism managed to be successful, the PLO in the occupied territories and most of the Hamas did not manage to do so. They were unsuccessful up to now to obtain a Palestinian homeland. But in general, this second wave was pretty successful, and it declined, of course, once all the former European colonial empires were dissolved. There were no more territories to be liberated from colonial empires. So it declined in what at that time was called the Third World, but it emerged, or somehow, yes, it started in Europe, where in two states notably, anti-colonial terrorist groups emerged in Spain, in the Basque country with ETA, and in Northern Ireland with the Irish Republican Army. The actions of these two groups were partly successful. They obtained kind of autonomy, but they did not obtain political independence. In Europe emerged the third wave of terrorism, distinguished by Rappaport's the new left wave. It started as an indirect consequence of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, the American war in Vietnam, was perceived by left-wing activists, among them many students of May 68, etc., as all at once an anti-colonial and an anti-capitalist war. Anti-colonial because Vietnam had been first a French colony, then it had been occupied by the Japanese during World War II, then once again a French colony, and then the Americans intervened. So it was an anti-colonial war, but it was also an anti-imperialist or anti-capitalist war because of the US, of course, being a capitalist country. And as such, it seduced many Western left-wing activists in Europe and also in Latin America. In Latin America, the Vietnamese guerrilla was imitated by left-wing guerrilla groups. And in Europe, some left-wing radicals sympathized with the Latin American guerrilla. And those who were the most radical ended up going underground and formed terrorist cells in order to fight capitalism by terrorist means. A small minority, of course, was the case in Italy with the Brigate Rosse. It was the case in Germany with the Rote Armee Fraktion, also called Bader-Meinhof, and it was called Ulrike Meinhof and Andreas Bader, the two leaders of the Rote Armee Fraktion, and in France, Action Directe. These left-wing terrorists once again resorted to violence targeted against specific individuals, not necessarily politicians, but individuals representative symbols of the capitalist exploitation, of the capitalist oppression, to use their terms. In Germany, it was the head of the Employers Association, Hans-Martin Schleyer, who was killed in 1977. In Italy, it was the Prime Minister Aldo Moro, killed in 1978. And in France, in the 80s, 1986, it was the Chief Executive Officer of the car maker Renault, who was killed. Georges Pes is his name. So Western Europe, left-wing radicals, the PLO, some groups within the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, were also close to this left-wing groups. So there was a mixture of anti-colonial and new left terrorism. There were also connections between Western European terrorist groups, Japanese one, Near East or Middle East groups, and Latin American ones. And the last name who deserves to be mentioned, I think, is the terrorist of Venezuelan origin, Carlos, who had been a student in Moscow. And he invented what has been called mercenary terrorism. That is to say, he hired terrorists who were pretty often killers and criminals, and he offered his services as a terrorist group to different autocratic leaders of the Third World, to Gaddafi, notably to Hafez al-Assad, the father of today's Bashir al-Assad. He launched terrorist attacks in Paris, in Vienna against the OPEC headquarters, etc., etc. In Europe, the left wing, he was made prisoner some years ago. In Europe, this third wave, just as the first one, was absolutely unable to provoke any kind of popular support. And logically, then left-wing terrorism sank into insignificance. Meanwhile, a fourth wave had emerged: religious terrorism, and its specificity, suicide attacks. The first suicide attacks took place in Sri Lanka, so by non-Islamist groups, and I will focus on Islamist terrorism within this religious wave, and to better understand the emergence of nowadays Islamist terrorism, the one that hit our Western societies during the two past decades. To understand this emergence, we have to go back to the historical background, historical context. And I think we should distinguish three turning points, three watersheds. 1979 first, because of two events, the revolution in Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In January 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini managed to get rid of the Shah's regime in Iran. And the Iranian Revolution, the Shia Revolution, internationalized Islamist violence among the Shia Muslims, notably the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which emerged at the beginning of the 80s. I will come back to this. Immediately, the Hezbollah in Lebanon were the first group to resort within Islamic finance to suicide terrorism. And though there is no empirical proof of this, the majority of experts and academics agree in saying that the terrorist attacks against the French anti-American troops stationed in Beirut in 1983, 240 American GI and Marines, and a bit less than 60 French paratroops were killed in a suicide attack staged by a lorry against the headquarters of the troops concerned, a suicide attack by a Hezbollah terrorists. This is what is believed to have happened, though there is no empirical proof of this. So 1979, the Iranian Revolution at the origin of Shia suicide attacks. And 1979, the Soviets invade and occupy Afghanistan. And Saudi Arabia started sponsoring the different mujahidins, the different Islamic fighters, in order to expel the Soviets. And within these Islamic fighters, some resorted to terrorism, including to suicide terrorism. So Saudi Arabia sponsored suicide terrorist attacks in Afghanistan in the 1980s. So 1979, the first important year, 1982, the second year that I would like you to remember. 1982, Israel launched its Operation Peaceful Galilee in South Lebanon to expel the PLO that had staged during years terrorist attacks against the Israeli territory from South Lebanon. So Israel wanted to get rid of the terrorists of the PLO, different groups forming the PLO, and invaded southern Lebanon. So it was successful. The PLO was more or less defeated. Arafat had to flee to Tunis. He was saved by a French ship. And then the Syrian dictator aimed at killing him in order to control the Palestinian political movement. Anyway, the PLO was defeated, but the indirect, the perverse consequence of this was that within the Palestinian population living notably in the Gaza Strip and also in the West Bank, since there was no more politically credible PLO, a new movement emerged, the Hamas. And the Hamas refers to Islamist faith and not to the secular ideology of the PLO. 1982, and last but not least, 1991. 1991, why? Because in Algeria, first elections took place. The aim of these elections, organized by the FLN, Front de Libération Nationale, the official party at power since the beginning of the 60s, when Algeria became independent. The aim was to try to re-legitimize the political regime accused by the populations, the Algerian citizens, to be corrupt and worse. So there was an attempt to re-legitimize the regime. The problem is that these elections were won by Islamic political parties, notably the Islamic Salvation Front. So some members of this Islamic Salvation Front, disillusioned with Western-style democratic processes. We won the elections, but these elections were nullified. What did they decide to do? Well, they resorted to terrorist actions, and a new civil war emerged, started in Algeria, opposing Islamists to the government of the National Liberation Front. So this civil war lasted some 10 years or so, with probably 100,000 people killed in Algeria. And in 91, once again, took place, that Operation Desert Storm against Iraq to force Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops from Kuwait. This worked, but American troops had deployed during the months preceding this operation, that is to say, during Operation Desert Shield, they had been deployed in the Saudi Arabian desert, close to the Kuwaiti and the Iraqi border. In the Saudi Arabian desert, that is to say, there where, for the Muslims, the two major holy sites of Islam are located, Mecca and Medina, and some fundamentalist Islamists in Saudi Arabia, including bin Laden, did not accept the presence of non-Muslims on the Saudi Arabian soil because of the two holy Muslim sites in Saudi Arabia. So these international and regional political events and processes all contributed to the rise of Islamist terrorist networks. The specific impact, ladies and gentlemen, of this fourth wave is the fact that Islamist terrorists resort to suicide attacks. And they resort to suicide attacks within a kind of sacramental act of spiritual salvation. They undertake these attacks as the result of a kind of what we may call a theological imperative. And in doing so, of course, the number of victims is likely to increase, usually. Different researches have shown that the average number of attacks is 3 victims when an attack is undertaken with a small hand gun. Average 3 people, 3 casualties. 7 casualties when a remote controlled bomb is used. And more than 10 casualties when a terrorist uses a suicide belt. And roughly 100 people are killed when an explosive-laden car or truck is used. Of course, these numbers are ridiculously small when compared to the most spectacular terrorist attack ever, 9/11, of course, which provoked the death of almost 3,000 victims. These terrorist attacks, ladies and gentlemen, these suicide attacks, of course, ended with the death of the terrorists launching the attack. He who organized these attacks, Osama bin Laden, as regards Al-Qaeda, did not die. He did not commit suicide. What does that mean? This means that the religious dimension to accept to commit suicide within a kind of theological imperative this tends to prove that the religious dimension, though being present, of course, should not lead us to believe that Islamist terrorism is not a political violence. Of course it is. The proof is that those who organize these attacks, those who look for the victims likely to be hit, those who designate the targets, to put it differently, those who are responsible for the timing of the attacks, they do not accept to die, nor are they characterized by any kind of psychological abnormality. To put it differently, and I here am inspired notably by the American researcher Robert Pape, suicide terrorism is absolutely irrational. It is what we may call the rationality of irrationality. It seems to be irrational from the point of view of he or she accepting to commit suicide. At least as regards Western rationality, this is somehow irrational. But we should not forget that already Japanese kamikazes accepted to commit suicide during World War II in order to try to defeat the Americans. Anyway, the seemingly irrational behavior of terrorist suicide bombers is rational when seen from the perspective of those who organize these attacks and those who pursue a political objective with these terrorist attacks, which goals then are pursued by those who organize these suicide bombings. Well, according to Robert Pape, terrorist networks, Islamist terrorist networks, pursue national independence. They want to achieve what they consider to be their territorial homelands, national independence, or political self-determination. That is to say, they want to get rid all at once of the political regime in the state concerned, which they consider to be illegitimate, and they want to get rid of those who politically or militarily back these regimes. In our case, the Western liberal democracies, but Russia too, notably in Syria, intervened in order to support Assad's regime. So these terrorist attacks then pursue a political aim against the local rulers, but also, and this is what has been proven empirically, proven by the article of Simon Conrad-Wexler and his co-authors, Do Foreign Occupations Cause Suicide Attacks? That is to say, the terrorist attacks not merely target the domestic political regime, but also the troops that Western countries or Russia sent in order to support the local rulers. Very concretely, suicide attacks occur, this has been shown in this article, whether the occupier is a democratic state or not. Pretty often in the West, when terrorist attacks take place, the dominant, the mainstream interpretation, notably in the media and in the discourses of our politicians, consists in saying they attack our democracy, they attack our freedom, they attack our values. They want to impose their values. The article by Conrad-Wexler and his co-authors shows that occupiers are targeted, be they democratic occupiers, Western liberal states, or not, Russia in the case of Syria, or the USSR in the case of Afghanistan during the 1980s. So it's not that sure that democracy as such is the target of Islamist terrorists. Anyway, what is beyond that is that also in this article, it was shown that the number of suicide attacks increases when occupations, the occupying forces are distinct religiously. That is to say, when they do not share, in this case, the Islamic faith, which is the case of both Westerners and of Russians. One more recent research, ladies and gentlemen, Alex Braithwaite's article, Transnational Terrorism as an Unintended Consequence of Military Footprints, goes a step further. The term transnational terrorism here is the most important one. He shows that not merely do terrorist networks attack occupying forces stationed in what they consider to be their homeland, or in what they want to transform into their homeland or their ummah, their Islamic community. But what's more, these terrorist networks undertake terrorist attacks in the societies of their occupiers, be they Russians or, as regards our topic here, our Western liberal democracies. That is to say, we sent our troops both to support local rulers and to get rid of terrorists, precisely because they try to overthrow their local rulers. We send our troops And so indirectly, we provoke these terrorist networks to undertake their attacks, not merely against our troops, but also in our own societies. Therefore, it is an unintended consequence of our military presence in these countries. And Braithwaite found out that, I cite his research, his finding, the probability that a state that intervenes in another state, probability that this state is hit by a terrorist attack is 60 times higher than a state that does not intervene in the homeland of the terrorist network concerned. And given that, as I hope I have shown in the different previous chapters, given that our Western liberal democracies have a temptation to spread their values and to defend their interests via the local rulers in the countries concerned, since we have a tendency to intervene in these countries, we are indeed likely to be hit by this transnational or global Islamist terrorism. And this is all the more so true, ladies and gentlemen, because of precisely the way we conduct our war. And I come back to the two chapters regarding drone warfare and the professional armies. We saw that drones permit our armies to wage wars which almost kill none of our own forces. And we are able, thanks to drones, to kill terrorists or opponents in general wherever they hide. That is to say, the whole world to some extent is the battlefield. There is no more sovereignty. The whole world is a kill box. And wherever the terrorists or opponents more generally may be tempted to flee, they will never be in safe zones. They are likely to be killed. Conversely, our operators of drones are invulnerable. They operate their drones from a computer screen, a laptop screen somewhere in our countries. And more, our Western armies do no longer send massive troops. In the states concerned, we sent some special operation forces who are able not to get killed by their political opponents. To put it differently, there is a huge imbalance, favorable to Western military interventions and detrimental to those who do not want us to intervene in what they consider to be their affairs. What then do these opponents do? Well, they look for a kind of retaliation. I am unable to kill my enemies because they are not physically present. So what do? Well, I try to reestablish a balance by attacking the people who in these societies are unable to protect themselves, just as we are unable to protect ourselves from drone strikes, just as a terrorist is not knowing that he is about to be killed by a drone strike. An innocent citizen individual in our Western society does not know that he or she is about to be killed in a suicide attack that is about to be launched. A kind of rebalance, a retaliation in order to try to rebalance the relation between the two belligerents from the point of view of the networks. This is a very irrational way of waging wars. So the victims, the innocent victims in our Western societies, to some extent, are the equivalent of the Islamist terrorists who are about to be killed by our drone strikes. They try to compensate for their inferiority by killing innocent people, hoping in doing so that there will be pressure exerted, direct or indirect, upon our politicians to no longer intervene in their countries, the countries that these terrorists consider to be their home limits. The political conclusion, the practical conclusion that can be drawn, and that is drawn by Robert Pape in his article published 19 years ago now, is the following one. The more we intervene in other states in order to try to get rid of terrorism, the more we create new terrorist actions, and the more we get ourselves vulnerable to terrorist attacks. To some extent, this is the conclusion that, at least indirectly, was drawn by Joe Biden when he decided in August 2021 to withdraw the troops from Afghanistan, the American troops from Afghanistan. He also justified it by the impossibility of building a kind of Western-style state in Afghanistan. He also justified it by the need for the US to focus on China's rise, and to some extent also Russia, given he has been proven right, given Russia's behavior in Ukraine anyway. But indirectly too, his decision may be the consequence of the awareness that by intervening more and more massively in the Muslim countries, we somehow indirectly provoke the terrorist attacks that our populations are victim of. To claim this, ladies and gentlemen, is of course a very bold statement. So let's be cautious. You know, in my epistemological conviction, there is no definitive truth. In social sciences, there are only more or less rigorous analysis. So if I feel free to put forward this somehow disturbing hypothesis, it is not because I claim that it's the only valid explanation of terrorism, of course not. It is because I feel free to ask somehow disturbing questions. I do think that this is what academics should do. Thank you very much for attending today's lecture, ladies and gentlemen, the last one, and thank you for listening to all my lectures. Wish you very well for the rest of your career, for the rest of your studies, for your plans in the future, etc. Thank you once again. Goodbye.